It is before dawn on a Roman road somewhere between Antioch and Rome, and a man is running. He carries a leather satchel stamped with the imperial seal. His sandals are military issue, thick-soled, triple-strapped, built for distance. The road beneath him is not dirt. It is stone, fitted stone, laid flat, cambered at the center to drain rain to the sides, wide enough for 2 carts to pass without touching. This road has been here for 200 years. It will be here for 200 more. At the next checkpoint, soldiers wave him through without stopping him. They know the seal. They know the route. They know that the empire and Apos' nervous system, its laws, its orders, its commerce, its letters, moves at the speed of a man who can run this road without losing his footing in the dark. Now pull back. Not just this road. Every road. 50,000 miles of them, stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. And at this moment, on every one of them, something is moving. Grain from Egypt, soldiers from Gaul, merchants from Persia, and soon, very soon, a message that will change what it means to be human. None of the Romans who built these roads knew they were building a delivery system for a gospel they had never heard. That is what we're talking about today. The Apostle Paul, writing to a small church in the region of Galatia around AD 48 or 49, used one sentence to describe what we're going to spend the next 25 minutes unpacking. He wrote, and quote, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law." End quote. The phrase is pleroma to chrono in Greek, and it is not a throwaway line. Pleroma does not mean fullness the way you might say a room is full of people. It means fullness the way an engineer means it when a dam has reached capacity. It means a process that has arrived at its completion point, a vessel filled to the brim, a tension that has reached its tipping point and can only resolve in one direction. Paul was not saying that enough time had passed. He was saying that everything was ready. And to understand one quote, everything in quote, means you have to go back, not just decades, but centuries. Because the answer to why Jesus arrived when he did and not 500 years earlier or 500 years later involves 3 civilizations that had no idea they were cooperating. It involves a Greek conqueror who died young and accidentally prepared the world to read a gospel he had never heard. It involves a Roman emperor who believed he was a god and unknowingly fulfilled a prophecy written 7 centuries before he was born. And it involves a scattered people, tired, waiting, aging, who had been holding a flame in the dark for 400 years. Stay with me, because by the end of this, the timing of Christmas will never feel accidental to you again. But first, you have to understand the silence. Between the last word of the Old Testament and the first word of the New Testament, there is a gap of roughly 400 years. Scholars call it the intertestamental period. The Jewish people called it something closer to abandonment. The last prophet to speak was Malachi. His final words were a warning and a promise, a coming messenger, a coming day, a coming fire. And then, nothing. No new prophets, no new revelation, no burning bush, no still small voice, no vision in the night. The heavens, which had spoken to Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel, went quiet. 400 years is not a short silence. 400 years ago from today, the Pilgrims had not yet sailed. Shakespeare had just died. The telescope had just been invented. 400 years is long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall. Long enough for people to stop expecting anything at all. And yet, the synagogue stayed open. This is one of the most remarkable facts in all of religious history. Through the Babylonian exile, through Persian rule, through Alexander and Apos, as conquest, through the brutal Seleucid occupation, through the rise of Rome, the Jewish people kept reading. They kept praying. They kept teaching their children the same scrolls, the same promises, the same names of a God who had gone quiet, but whom they refused to stop addressing. By the time Jesus was born, there were synagogues in Alexandria and Antioch, in Rome and Corinth, in Ephesus and Thessalonica. Wherever the Jewish diaspora had scattered, and it had scattered far, it had planted a room with scrolls and a community that met on the Sabbath to read them. Paul did not build the first-century church network. He walked into one that already existed. City after city, a synagogue was already there, already filled with people who've been reading Isaiah and Daniel and the Psalms for 400 years. The silence was not absence. The silence was preparation. There's another Greek word you need to know before we go further. The Greeks had two words for time. The first is chronos, clock time, calendar time, the kind of time that moves whether anything is happening or not. Seconds becoming minutes, becoming years. Chronos is time as quantity. The second word is kairos. And kairos is something else entirely. Kairos is appointed time. It is the moment when conditions align and action becomes possible or inevitable. Archers use this word to describe the split second when the wind drops and the shot is clear. Weavers used it to describe the precise moment in a pattern when the shuttle must pass through or the whole design is lost. When Paul wrote pleroma to chrono, he was not describing a chronos moment. He was describing a kairos one. God did not simply wait long enough. God waited until the shot was clear. And to see why the shot was clear when it was, you have to look at what had been assembled in the 2 centuries before the first Christmas. Not by prophets, not by priests, by emperors, generals, and engineers who thought they were building something for themselves. The first river is Rome. In 27 BC, a man named Gaius Octavius stood before the Roman Senate and accepted a new title. He became Augustus, the revered one. And with that title began what historians would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. A period stretching roughly 2 centuries in which the Mediterranean world, for the first time in recorded history, was unified under a single political authority. Now understand what this meant practically. Before the Pax Romana, travel was dangerous. Pirates controlled the sea lanes. Bandits worked the mountain passes. Cities built walls not for aesthetics, but for survival. A letter sent from Jerusalem to Rome might never arrive. A merchant crossing from Greece to Spain did so at genuine risk of his life. Augustus cleared the seas. His navy hunted pirates from the Mediterranean until the shipping lanes were safer than they had ever been. His legions secured the roads. His engineers built and maintained 50,000 miles of stone highway, the finest road system the ancient world had ever seen, and one that would not be matched in scope until the 20th century. Here is what the Roman road system meant for the first century church. A missionary could leave Antioch and reach Rome in about 4 weeks. He could walk or ride through checkpoints where soldiers maintained order, stop at official posting stations where horses and provisions were available, and arrive in the imperial capital without being robbed, kidnapped, or killed. Risks that would have been reasonable fears for any traveler 2 centuries earlier. Eusebius, the early church historian writing in the 4th century, was the first to make the connection explicit. He wrote that God had prepared the nations for the gospel by first bringing them under one political power, so that the apostles would not face the impossible obstacle of crossing hostile borders between warring kingdoms at every stage of their journey. One empire, one legal system, one road network. The world had never been this navigable before. But the road system is not even the most striking thing about Augustus. Here is what most people miss. In the decade before Jesus was born, the Roman Empire launched one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in ancient history, built entirely around the person of Augustus Caesar. Poets were commissioned, coins were minted, inscriptions were carved into stone in public squares from Britain to Babylon. And the titles that appeared on those inscriptions are extraordinary. Augustus was called Divi Filius, Son of God. He was called Soter, Savior. He was called the one who had brought peace to the whole world. His birthday was declared a holy day. The Roman calendar was reorganized around his reign. One inscription from the city of Priene in modern Turkey, dated to 9 BC, proclaimed that the birthday of Augustus was the beginning of good news for the world, and the Greek word used for in quote, good news in quote, was euangelion. The Gospel. The Roman Empire had spent decades teaching the entire Mediterranean world a vocabulary. Son of God, Savior, good news, peace. And then Jesus arrived and used every single one of those words to describe something Rome had never imagined. When early Christians called Jesus Soter, Every Roman in the room knew exactly what they were claiming. They were not using religious jargon. They were making a political statement that would get people killed. And they made it anyway, because the vocabulary was already there. Because Augustus, who believed he was the fulfillment of human history, had accidentally prepared an audience for a different fulfillment entirely. Tacitus, the Roman historian who had no interest in Christianity and no reason to flatter it, recorded in his histories something remarkable. He noted that across the East, and particularly among the Jewish people, there was a powerful and widespread expectation that someone from Judea would soon rise to rule the world. He dismissed it. He assumed the prophecy referred to Vespasian, the Roman general who would become emperor, but he recorded it. Even Rome and Apos, most skeptical historians noticed that the world was watching the eastern horizon and waiting for something. The roads were ready. The vocabulary was ready. The watching was already happening. Rome had built a delivery system without knowing what it would carry. And then there is the census. Luke records it with the brevity of a man who has no idea what he is describing. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. One sentence, one bureaucratic act by an emperor managing tax records across a sprawling empire. Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth. But Roman law requires registration in the city of one and Apos' ancestral line. Joseph is of the line of David. David and Apos' city is Bethlehem. Bethlehem is 90 miles south through the hill country of Judea, over rough terrain, in the final weeks of a pregnancy. They go. 700 years before this journey, the prophet Micah wrote a single sentence. You, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Augustus did not read Micah. Augustus did not know about Bethlehem. Augustus was managing an empire and needed accurate census data and issued an administrative decree, because that is what emperors do. And Mary and Apos' labor began in Bethlehem. The Kairos moment does not announce itself. It arrives through a tax form. The second river begins with a young man who wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. His name was Alexander. He was 20 years old when he crossed into Persia. He was 25 when he reached Egypt and founded a city that would bear his name for the next 2,000 years. He was 32 when he died in Babylon, feverish and exhausted, having marched his army from Greece to the edge of India and back. He had conquered more territory in 13 years than Rome would accumulate in 3 centuries. And when he died, he left behind something more durable than any of his victories. He left behind a language. Alexander did not set out to be a linguist. He set out to be a god. But wherever his armies went, Greek culture followed. Greek architecture, Greek philosophy, Greek commerce, Greek schools. And most importantly, Greek speech. Not the classical Greek of Plato and Thucydides, which was the polished literary language of the educated elite. Something simpler. Something that happened when Greek soldiers and merchants and administrators mixed daily with Egyptians and Persians and Syrians and Phoenicians, and a language had to flatten itself out to be understood by everyone. The scholars call it koine. It simply means common. Koine Greek became the street language of the ancient world. You could walk from Athens to Alexandria to Antioch to Jerusalem and be understood. Not by everyone, but by enough. By merchants and soldiers and government officials and educated tradesmen. By the kind of people who would later sit in synagogues and marketplaces and listen to a man named Paul explain something they had never heard before. Now pay attention to this. The New Testament was not written in Hebrew. It was not written in Aramaic, which was the daily spoken language of Jesus and his disciples. It was written in Koine Greek. Every letter Paul sent to Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi and Rome. Every account of Jesus and Apos' life written by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Every vision John recorded on the island of Patmos. All of it Koine Greek, because that was the language the world could read. Alexander died 323 years before Jesus was born. He never heard the gospel. He had no interest in the God of Israel. He was by most accounts a brilliant and brutal man who wanted to be worshipped and largely was. But the linguistic infrastructure he left behind, the common tongue that stretched across 3 continents, became the medium through which the most important message in human history would travel. He built the pipe without knowing what would flow through it. But Greece gave the world something even more specific than a language. It gave the world the scriptures in that language. Around 285 BC, in the great city of Alexandria, the city Alexander had built at the mouth of the Nile, something extraordinary happened. Ptolemy II, the Greek king of Egypt, commissioned a translation of the Jewish scriptures into Greek. The project assembled 72 Jewish scholars, and the resulting translation became known as the Septuagint, from the Latin for 70, abbreviated as LXX. Think carefully about what this means. Before the Septuagint, the Hebrew scriptures were accessible only to people who could read Hebrew. That was not the ancient world in Apos, as common language. Hebrew was a sacred tongue, preserved by priests and scholars, read aloud in synagogues to communities who often could not follow the text themselves. The scriptures were inside a linguistic wall. The Septuagint knocked the wall down. Suddenly, Isaiah and Apos, as prophecies, written in Hebrew 700 years before Jesus, were available in the language the entire Mediterranean world could read. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage that the early church would cite again and again as a description of Jesus, was already translated into Greek before the first Christmas. Isaiah 7 verse 14, the virgin birth prophecy, was already in Greek. Micah 5 verse 2, the Bethlehem passage, was already in Greek. When Philip the evangelist met an Ethiopian official on a desert road in Acts chapter 8, and the official was sitting in his chariot reading from Isaiah, he was reading the Septuagint. He was reading a Greek translation of a Hebrew text that had been commissioned by a pagan king in Egypt 300 years earlier. And Philip climbed into that chariot and explained that the passage was about Jesus. The Ethiopian understood every word, because the language was already his. Here is the part nobody tells you. The early church did not primarily quote from the Hebrew Old Testament. They quoted from the Septuagint. Paul and Apos' letters are saturated with Septuagint quotations. So is the book of Hebrews. So is the book of Revelation. The Greek-speaking world already had the scriptures in their language, already had access to the prophecies, already had the raw material, and they had had it for 250 years before anyone connected it to the man from Nazareth. This was not a coincidence of publishing. This was infrastructure. A pagan king in Egypt wanted a collection of foreign religious texts for his famous library. He commissioned a translation. He got his copy. The scholars went home, and the document they produced quietly became the most quoted book in the New Testament. And there is one more thing Greece contributed that is harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. By the time Jesus began his ministry, the Greek philosophical tradition had spent 4 centuries asking the same questions. Plato had asked about the nature of the soul and the good. Aristotle had asked about purpose and final causes. The Stoics had developed the concept of the logos, the rational principle that orders the universe, the divine reason that gives the world its coherence. When John sat down to write the opening of his gospel, he did not begin with a genealogy. He did not begin with a birth story. He began with, "In the beginning was the Word." The Greek word he used was logos. Every Greek-educated reader in the first century knew that word. They had been discussing the logos for 400 years as an abstract philosophical concept, as a divine principle, as the mind behind the cosmos. And John walked straight into that conversation and said, "The logos became flesh." The divine reason you have been looking for is not a concept. He has a name. He grew up in a carpenter and Apos' house in Galilee, and you can touch the scars in his hands. Alexander conquered the world with a sword, but the world he left behind was asking the right questions. And the gospel walked into a world that was already mid-sentence and finished it. The third river is the oldest and most painful. It does not begin with a conquering general or an engineering marvel. It begins with a city on fire. In 586 BC, The Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls of Jerusalem after an 18-month siege. The temple Solomon had built, the house where God had said his name would dwell, was torn down stone by stone. The priests were executed. The royal family was blinded. And the surviving population of Judah was marched east into exile, into a foreign land, to serve a foreign king under a foreign sky. They sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept. The Psalms say so. And if you have ever lost the thing you built your entire life around, you understand something of what that weeping sounded like. But here's what they did next. They could not go to the temple, so they built something else, somewhere to gather, somewhere to read the scrolls they had carried out of Jerusalem in their arms, somewhere to teach their children the names of the God who, they still believed, against all visible evidence, had not abandoned them. They built synagogues, and when the exile ended, when Cyrus of Persia issued his decree and the Jewish people were permitted to return, not everyone went back. Some had built lives in Babylon. Some had settled in Egypt. Some had moved west, following trade routes into Greece and Asia Minor and eventually into Rome itself. The diaspora, the scattering, did not reverse when the exile ended. It continued. It spread. By the 1st century AD, the Jewish population outside of Israel was larger than the Jewish population inside it. Josephus, the Jewish historian who served as an eyewitness chronicler of the 1st century, estimated that Jewish communities existed in virtually every city of the known world. Alexandria had a Jewish quarter so large it occupied 2 of the city and Apos, as 5 districts. Rome had multiple synagogues. Corinth had 1. Thessalonica had 1. Ephesus had 1. Philippi had 1. Every city Paul visited on his missionary journeys, every single one, he went to the synagogue first. This was not just habit. It was strategy, because in every synagogue, there were already people who had been reading Isaiah for 400 years. People who already knew the vocabulary of sacrifice and redemption and covenant and Messiah. People who were, in many cases, already expecting someone. Paul did not walk into cold rooms. He walked into rooms that had been kept warm for centuries. Now watch what happens next. Among the scrolls those exiles carried out of Jerusalem was a book that would become, in the 2 centuries before Jesus, the most urgently read document in the Jewish world. The Book of Daniel. Daniel had been written during the Babylonian exile, or, in the view of critical scholars, during the later Seleucid persecution under Antiochus IV Epiphanes around 165 BC. Either way, by the 1st century it was ancient, it was authoritative, and it contained something that was making people count on their fingers. In chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, an angel named Gabriel visits Daniel and delivers what has come to be called the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Gabriel tells Daniel that 70 weeks of years, 490 years, have been decreed over Jerusalem and the Jewish people. At the end of this period, several things will happen. Transgression will be finished, sin atoned for, everlasting righteousness brought in, and the Anointed One, the Messiah, will appear. The calculations are disputed. Scholars have been arguing about the arithmetic for 2,000 years and will continue arguing. But here's the point that matters for our purposes. By the time of Jesus, people were counting. Jewish communities across the empire were reading Daniel 9 and doing the math. The community at Qumran, the ascetic group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, was so focused on Daniel and Apos' timeline that they had organized their entire communal life around the expectation of an imminent arrival. They had separated themselves from Jerusalem, gone into the desert, and were living in a state of constant preparation. They believed the moment was close. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in caves above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, give us a window into the intensity of 1st century messianic expectation that we would not otherwise have. These were not casual readers. These were people who had walked away from their homes and their livelihoods to wait in the desert because they believed Daniel and Apos' timeline was almost up. They copied Isaiah obsessively. The great Isaiah scroll found at Qumran is one of the oldest complete manuscripts of any biblical book ever discovered. They wrote their own commentaries on the prophets, applying ancient predictions to their own moment. They were watching, intently, with their whole lives. And they were not alone. Across the empire, the expectation was building in ways that went beyond careful scholarship. It had become something closer to pressure. Herod the Great had been appointed king of Judea by Rome in 37 BC. He was not Jewish by blood in any way that satisfied his subjects. He was Idumean, a people forcibly converted to Judaism a generation earlier, and the Jewish population never fully accepted his legitimacy. Herod knew this, and Herod responded to insecurity the way insecure, powerful men always respond, with surveillance, with violence, and with paranoia that grew more acute as he aged. By the time the Magi arrived in Jerusalem asking where the king of the Jews had been born, Herod was an old man in physical agony. Ancient sources describe him suffering from a disease so severe that his body was visibly deteriorating, and he was still executing people he suspected of plotting against him. He had killed his own wife. He had killed 3 of his own sons. Augustus, who had heard enough of these stories, made a dark joke. It was safer to be Herod Antipas, as pig, than Herod Antipas, as son. When Herod heard about a newborn king, he did not need long to decide what to do. The massacre of the infants in Bethlehem, the event Matthew records and that Herod Antipas, as own character makes entirely credible, was not the act of a stable ruler responding to a manageable threat. It was the act of a dying man who had spent decades crushing anything that looked like a rival, lashing out one final time at a threat he could not even locate precisely. But here is what the massacre reveals about the moment. The messianic expectation had become so intense, so widespread, so publicly discussed, that even a paranoid Roman client king took it seriously enough to kill children over it. This was not a fringe religious idea held by a handful of desert scholars. This was the air the first century breathed. Tacitus recorded it. Suetonius referenced it. Roman historians, men with no sympathy for Jewish religion and no reason to take its prophecies seriously, noted that the Eastern world was alive with the expectation that a great ruler would emerge from Judea. The pressure had been building for 400 years, and the vessel was almost full. There's a word in Hebrew, anavim, that does not translate cleanly into English. It refers to the poor ones, the humble ones, the ones who have nothing left to hold on to except the promises of God. In the Psalms, the anavim are the people who have been waiting so long and have been disappointed so many times that they have stopped expecting anything from human power. They're not cynical. They're something more refined than cynical. They're people whose hope has been stripped of everything except its purest form, a hope that is no longer about outcomes they can control, but about a God they cannot see doing something they cannot engineer. By the time Jesus was born, Israel had produced generations of anavim, and 2 of them were still alive, still watching, still in the temple. Their names were Simeon and Anna, and we will come back to them, because their story is the place where all 3 rivers finally meet. Before we bring the 3 rivers together, there's one more thread, because the story of the Pleroma is not just a Mediterranean story. In the same decades that Augustus was consolidating Roman power in the West, something equally significant was happening at the other end of the known world. The Han Dynasty of China, the empire that ruled the eastern terminus of what we now call the Silk Road, was at the peak of its power and reach. Han emperors had pushed trade routes westward through Central Asia, through Parthia, through Mesopotamia, all the way to the edges of the Roman Empire. Silk moved west, glass moved east, and along those routes, in the caravanserais and the market cities and the border towns, ideas moved too. The world of 4 BC was the most connected it had ever been. Not connected the way our world is connected, instantly, frictionlessly, digitally. Connected the way a living thing is connected, slowly, organically, through 10,000 individual contacts and exchanges and crossings. But connected nonetheless. A merchant leaving Chong and Apos, and could, in theory, eventually reach Rome. The chain of hands was long, but it was unbroken. Why does this matter? Because it means that when the gospel began to move, when it left Jerusalem and traveled along Roman roads, and across Mediterranean Sea lanes, and into synagogues in every major city. It was entering a world that already knew how to transmit things across vast distances. The infrastructure of transmission was not built for the gospel, but the gospel used every inch of it. The Magi who came from the east to find Jesus, whatever their precise origin, whether Persia or Babylon or further still, were themselves a product of this connected world. Men who read the stars, men who moved across borders, men who arrived in Jerusalem asking questions that suggested they had been watching the eastern sky with the same intensity that Simeon and Anna had been watching the temple courts. The watching was not only Jewish, the watching was global, and the world had never been more ready to receive an answer. Now, let the three rivers run together. Rome has built the roads and cleared the seas and given the world a postal system and a legal framework that will carry the gospel from Jerusalem to the edges of the known world in a single generation. Rome has also, without intending to, rehearsed the vocabulary. Son of God, Savior, good news, peace. The words are already in circulation. They're stamped on coins. They are carved in marble. They are in the mouths of people who have no idea they are rehearsing an announcement they have not yet heard. Greece has given the world a common language and placed the Hebrew scriptures in that language 2.5 centuries in advance. Isaiah and Apos, S description of a suffering servant who would be pierced for the transgressions of others, is already in Greek, already in synagogues, already being read aloud to communities across 3 continents. The philosophical tradition has spent 4 centuries building a hunger for the logos, the divine reason behind the cosmos, and John will arrive with the answer to a question Plato started asking 300 years before Jesus was born. Israel has scattered its synagogues into every city the gospel will visit. It has preserved the prophecies through 400 years of silence without losing a single letter. It has produced, through exile and suffering and long waiting, a people refined enough to recognize what they are seeing when they see it. The Anavim, the humble ones, the poor ones, the ones who have been waiting with nothing left but the promises, are still alive, still in the temple, still watching. And the timeline Daniel received from an angel in Babylon 6 centuries earlier is, by the calculations of people who have been doing nothing but count. Almost up. This is the pleroma. This is not poetry. This is engineering. 3 civilizations. 6 centuries. 50,000 miles of road. 1 common language. Hundreds of synagogues pre-positioned in every major city. A philosophical tradition asking the right questions. A prophetic tradition holding the right answers. A political vocabulary already primed. A global trade network already operating. And a people so refined by suffering that they could recognize a Messiah who arrived not on a war horse, but on a borrowed donkey. Paul looked at all of this and found one word: fullness, completion, the vessel at the brim. He was right, but he was also understating it. Now we come back to Simeon. Luke tells us almost nothing about him. We do not know his age, though the tradition that he was very old is consistent with the text. We do not know his family or his occupation or where in Jerusalem he lived. What Luke tells us is this: he was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit had told him, at some point in his long life, in some moment we are not given access to, that he would not die before he had seen the Lord and Apos as Messiah. Think about what it means to carry a promise like that for years. Decades, perhaps. Every morning you wake up and the promise is still unfulfilled. Every Passover, every Day of Atonement, every Sabbath, you walk to the temple and you watch and you wait and you go home still holding the promise. The years accumulate. The body slows. The people around you stop asking because they have grown tired of the question. And you keep going to the temple. On the day Mary and Joseph bring the infant Jesus to Jerusalem for the purification ritual, 40 days after the birth, as the law required, Luke tells us that Simeon came into the temple courts, not because it was a feast day, not because he had been summoned. Luke says the Spirit led him there. He saw the child. He took him in his arms. And he said words that the church has been praying ever since. The prayer Christians call the Nunc Dimittis from its first words in Latin. Now you dismiss. Lord, Now you let your servant depart in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation. He had been waiting his whole life for a 40-day-old baby, and he knew, immediately, without hesitation, after years of waiting and decades of faithful watching, when the moment finally arrived, he did not miss it. He walked straight to it. He took it in his arms. He spoke over it with a clarity and a peace that only comes to people who have been holding a promise long enough that they stopped being anxious about it. He was ready because he had never stopped being ready. Anna was there too. Luke gives her more biographical detail than he gives Simeon, which is itself remarkable in a first-century text. Ancient writers did not typically pause to record the life histories of elderly women. But Luke pauses. He tells us she was a prophet, that she was the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, that she had been married for 7 years before her husband died, and that she was now 84 years old, and that she had not left the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. Do the math quietly. If Anna married at 14 or 15, which was typical, and was widowed after 7 years, she had been a widow for over 60 years. 60 years of fasting and prayer in the temple courts. 60 years of watching and waiting. She had been doing this since before most of the people in that courtyard had been born. When she saw the child, she gave thanks to God and began speaking about him to everyone who was waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. She did not hesitate either. Here is what the story of Simeon and Anna tells you about the pleroma that no historical analysis can fully capture. The fullness of time is not only about roads and languages and political structures. It is also about people. Specifically, it is about people who have been shaped by long waiting into the kind of vessel that can hold what is coming without breaking. Simeon and Anna were not simply fortunate enough to be in the right place. They had spent their entire lives becoming people who could recognize the right moment when it arrived. The waiting had not made them bitter. It had made them sharp. It had stripped away everything else until all that remained was the watching. And when the moment came, when a young couple carried an ordinary-looking infant through an ordinary temple gate on an ordinary Tuesday morning, two old people who had been waiting longer than most people live walked straight to him. Because the fullness of time is not only an external convergence, it is also an internal one. The roads were ready. The language was ready. The scriptures were translated. The synagogues were positioned. The vocabulary was primed. The timeline was almost up. And in the temple courts, two people were ready too. So what do you do with all of this? You have seen the roads. You have seen the language. You have seen the synagogues and the scrolls and the philosophical hunger and the prophetic timeline ticking down. You have seen two old people in a temple courtyard who spent their entire lives becoming ready for a moment that lasted about 40 seconds and changed everything. What does any of it mean for the Tuesday morning you're going to wake up to tomorrow? 3 things. And the last one is the one I want you to carry with you. The first is this: God napos. Delays are not denials. They are constructions. When the 400 years of silence felt like abandonment, it was not abandonment. It was assembly. Every decade of that silence, something was being built. A road here, a translation there, a synagogue in a city the gospel would visit 30 years after Jesus rose from the dead. The silence had a shape. It had a purpose. It was not empty. It was filling. The Hebrew prophets did not experience that silence as meaningful. They experienced it as darkness. Malachi wrote his final words, and the heavens closed, and nobody who was alive when that happened lived to see them open again. Generation after generation of faithful people prayed toward a sky that did not answer and died still waiting. They were not abandoned. They were part of a construction project so large that no single life could see its outline. If you are in a season that feels like silence, if you have been praying toward a sky that is not answering, if the promise you're holding feels older than it should, if the waiting has gone on long enough that you have stopped telling people about it because you're tired of their questions, hear this. The silence is not the absence of God. The silence is what a construction site sounds like from the inside of the thing being built. You cannot see the outline from where you're standing. Simeon could not see it either. He just kept going to the temple. The second thing is this: the same pleroma logic applies to your life. Paul used the word to describe a moment in history. But the God who engineered that moment is the same God who is present in your story. And if you look carefully at your own life, at the things that seemed like accidents, at the detours that felt like failures, at the connections that appeared random, you will find the same pattern. The job you lost that sent you to a different city. The relationship that ended and left you in a church you would never have found otherwise. The closed door that redirected you toward the open one that turned out to matter. The delay that felt like punishment but was, in retrospect, protection. You may not see it yet. The Kairos moment does not announce itself in advance. It arrives through a tax form, through a census decree, through a 90-mile walk through hill country that nobody would have chosen voluntarily. But when it arrives, and it does arrive, you will look back and see that nothing was wasted. Not the roads built by people who did not know what they were building. Not the language preserved by people who did not know what it would carry. Not the synagogues maintained through 400 years of silence, by people who did not know that the man who would walk into them had not yet been born. Not the waiting. Not the silence. Not the years that felt like nothing was happening. Everything was happening. You just did not see the outline yet. And the third thing, the one I want you to hold on to after everything else fades, is this. You were not born at the wrong time. I know that feeling. You know that feeling? The sense that you arrived too late or too early. That the world you inherited is broken in ways that feel permanent. That the problems are too large and the resources too small, and the moment you are living in is not the moment you would have chosen. The people who built the Roman roads did not choose their moment either. They were soldiers and engineers doing what soldiers and engineers do. And they had no idea that 500 years after they laid the last stone, a Jewish tent maker from Tarsus would walk those roads and turn the empire upside down. Alexander did not choose to die at 32, leaving behind a linguistic legacy he never knew he was creating. The 72 scholars who worked on the Septuagint did not know they were translating documents that would be quoted thousands of times in a book that had not yet been written. Simeon did not choose to be born in the generation he was born in. He chose to keep going to the temple. You were placed in this moment the same way those roads were placed in that empire. Not randomly, not by accident, with a precision that you cannot fully see from where you are standing, in service of a purpose that is larger than your single life. The pleroma, the fullness, is not only a historical event that happened 2,000 years ago in a stable in Bethlehem. It is a principle. It is the declaration that God does not waste centuries, that the mechanisms of history, the empires and the exiles and the languages and the long silences, are not running loose and unattended, that somewhere above the chaos of the moment you're living in, there is a vessel filling, and it will be full, at exactly the right time. Not a Chronos moment, a Kairos one, not when enough time has passed, when everything is ready. A teenage girl in a one-room house in a hill town nobody important had ever visited said yes to an angel. A carpenter walked 90 miles through the Judean hill country because an emperor needed tax data. Two old people who had been waiting longer than most people live walked across a temple courtyard on an ordinary morning and immediately recognized what they were looking at. None of them saw the full outline. None of them knew they were standing at the convergence of 6 centuries of preparation. None of them understood that the roads and the language and the scrolls and the synagogues and the philosophical hunger and the prophetic timeline had all been moving toward this, toward a stable in Bethlehem, toward a young mother wrapping her firstborn in cloth, toward an old man lifting an infant in his arms and saying words that would be prayed in churches for the next 2,000 years. Now you let your servant depart in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation. He had been waiting his whole life for a 40-day-old baby. And when the baby arrived, he was ready, because he had never stopped being ready. Neither should you.